Hello, welcome to ATP's virtual conference. Today we're going to talk about, with my colleagues, evaluating the quality of high-stakes certification program against other programs, and it's really a comparative study. Joining me on this is Jen and Chris, and we'll get into introductions in a moment. But before we move on to introductions, what I want to do is, I did have a question for you, which is, if you're going to evaluate a program, what would you look at? What would you want to evaluate? So as we go through the presentation, consider that, because we probably didn't consider everything you could evaluate in a credentialing program. So on to introductions. I'm Manny Straley. I'm founder and president of Assessment Education Research Experts. We do psychometric consultation, exam development, policy modeling, and some educational consultation. So Jen, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Jennifer Naughton, and this is my cat for COVID-19. I am the president of Naughton Consulting, and I have 25 years in training, testing, and evaluation and assessment. And I've really been in every role, from a technical role all the way to a business owner and executive leadership on various association programs for credentialing.
Okay, Chris.
And I'm Christopher Wiese. I have about 15 years with CFA Institute. I'm the senior head of examination development, and prior to working in exam development for several years, led our curriculum development group.
Thank you, Chris. And Jen, if you could just go through the agenda for today, that'd be great.
All right. So while we're here, this is to talk about our comparative evaluation, looking across a number of different dimensions for certification programs. We included things such as organizational design. We've got interesting perspectives on not only the testing function, but also the learning function and the products that are associated with that. So why the study? The study was done because of a need for CFA Institute to do a comparative analysis across a number of different areas, because they're looking into restructuring and to basically deliver their programs a little differently. So this was a good time for them to take a look and see what the rest in the industry were doing. How we did it, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how did we find out, what did we find out, what the results were. Hey, do you mind if we start over? I'm sorry. Do you mind if we start over?
Hello, welcome to ATP's virtual conference. Today we're going to present on evaluating the quality of high-stakes certification program against other programs, and we're just going to compare CFA to other programs. Joining me today is my colleagues Jen and Chris, and we're going to introduce them in a moment. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question. When you're going to, since we're evaluating a program, I want to ask you, what would you look for when you evaluate your program? What are the bigger things that you look for? We're going to show you what we did, and I want you to think about that question throughout. And like I promised you, we're going to do introductions now. I'm Manny Straley. I'm founder and president of Assessment Education Research Experts. We're a consulting group that looks into psychometrics, competency modeling, exam development, accreditation, consultation, and even educational consultation as well. My other colleague here, Jen and Chris, if Jen, you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Manny. Hi, I'm Jennifer Naughton. I'm a master's in education, although I've been practicing in the training and certification and assessment worlds for about 25 years. I also have held technical and executive roles in associations, predominantly overseeing credentialing programs.
And Chris?
And I'm Christopher Wiese, senior head of exam development at CFA Institute. I've been with CFA Institute for just over 15 years. And prior to exam dev, I had several years overseeing our curriculum and our learning experience teams.
Great. And Jen, if you could tell us what we're going to be talking about today, that'd be great.
Sure, thanks, Manny. I'll just cover the flow just briefly. We'll talk a little bit about why we're here, why the study, sort of some of the things about how we did it and what we found out on that. What we found out, we're going to take a little bit of a different view than most of the most presentations of this kind, so that we can give you some pearls of wisdom that are a little bit less traditional. And that includes kind of covering a number of different areas. It includes both learning as well as certification. So we're not myopically focused just on certification. We'll also cover things like how is the organization designed and structured to support the credentialing activities. So there's a little bit of a different slice. We'll talk a little bit from our own perspectives about what our takeaways are, and then we'll pause to ask you what yours are.
Thanks, Jen. And Chris, when we approached you, if you could tell us why you approached us in terms of doing this study.
Absolutely. We were looking to benchmark the efficiency and efficacy of our practices. So we wanted to assess the quality and the effectiveness of our credentialing activities. Specifically, we wanted to build a view from a variety of perspectives on things like program management, org design, and how typical functions like practice analysis and exam development are run. The timing was precipitated by our shift to CBT. I think we were probably one of the last really big test providers moving from paper to computer-based testing. And given that most of you have made that journey already, we thought it was a good opportunity to see what we might learn by looking at others in the industry, and to see if us going to CBT might result in some different decisions about how we organize ourselves and conduct our activities. Benchmarking information is unfortunately not readily available. It's actually hard to come by. A lot of us, CFA Institute included, might struggle to identify direct head-on competitors, if you will, with which to benchmark. And so that led us to seek out Manny and Jennifer to help us take a really objective look at this. And I think I would just pause for 2 seconds there and say thank you to them, and thank you to the other organizations who participated and were willing to share some information about themselves.
Thank you, Chris. So, this is really the why. So, now that they hired us, we have to figure out how we're going to do this. So what we did is we looked at doing interviews among CFA staff, 5 credentialing organizations, and 5 credentialing consultants. And we actually asked them a lot of the similar questions. And what we did collect was, industry information, associations, whether they were accredited, the demographics, firmographics, and other relevant facts. And then what we did is we sort of put together a interview, basically, based upon research and surveys that had been conducted in the credentialing field. We also asked CFA to look at this interview protocol that we put together, and also our own experience with non-consultants and their consultants. So what this resulted in was topics that were organized into 6 blocks, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but it's product and program management, organizational design, practice analysis, curriculum development and learning, exam development, and exam administration. And, we were looking at organizations which had highest volume programs, and consultants discussed what they viewed as most typical and atypical, and commonalities and differences were also looked at and analyzed to see what we can summarize around that. Now, when we looked at these commonalities and differences or the results of all this, they were based upon a small group of people. So it was a case study. So when we're providing these findings, just note that you want to be cautious on how you generalize it, because this is just a snapshot, a very small case study, as I keep on saying. So when we're looking at these findings, we were looking at across product and program management, organizational design, the practice analysis or job analysis, curriculum and learning, exam development, and exam administration. And we're going to get into each of our findings. And we're not going to get into the key findings more so than all the findings. There's a lot of things that we found out about CFA and these programs that are very interesting. Unfortunately, we can't share them all today. So I'm going to have Jen talk about product and program management and organizational design.
Thanks, Manny. So starting out with product and program management, let me focus on satisfaction and value. I think that was the most interesting of the two. So as far as customer satisfaction goes and how it's measured, the most common way to measure satisfaction was by survey. In terms of value, salary and job opportunities that were available to the credential holders versus the non-credential holders were the most common value metric. In terms of the most innovative value measures, they included organizational influence, the ability to generate solutions effectively. Can an individual hold your credential? Are they more efficient and effective at developing solutions versus non? And things like increased employability and promotability. So those were some of the interesting, innovative value measures as far as product and program management go. So let's go ahead and focus on org design. Next slide. Okay, so there are 4 different points for this slide in this area, and the first is, not surprisingly, that most credentialing organizations were actually entities within a larger organization. And typically you would have the education programs such as PrEP would be separated out from the testing organization. So that was kind of the most common structure and how it was divided up. In terms of staffing of psychometricians, you had about half of the, and they're all large programs that we looked at. So you'll keep that in mind, but about half of them had an in-house psychometrician and half of them had outsourced that function. Structure. So structure in terms of how the departments and divisions were organized, this was kind of interesting. It was all over the place. It was either by program, you have a certain exam, and it would be the organization would have like little nodules, or staff that would be surrounded by exam, basically. Or it would be organized around function, kind of what individuals were doing in common functional areas. Or it was matrixed. So you had kind of the programs / exams, and the different functional areas were just matrixed across the board. So that's how the structure varied and varied across the different groups that we interviewed. Finally, wanted to talk a little about role specialization, and this kind of varied as a function of the organization size and the program size. But the smaller of the larger organizations tended to have a product management, exam development, and curriculum development team or specialized roles, more like specialized roles per individual. So the larger organizations tended to have psychometricians in-house, and then a really high degree of role specialization. I like to say it, like even one organization had an individual who was assigned to do practice analysis and focus just in that area, to give you an example of the level of role specialization that we found in terms of the larger organizations.
Thanks, Jen. So one of the things that we also looked at was the practice analysis as a block to interview and analyze the information and conduct this evaluation. So when you look at a practice analysis, these were the 4 areas that we looked at that were like really key differences here. When we talk about continuous versus periodic versus triggered update, that has to do when you conduct the analysis. So one thing we found is that CFA did it continuously on a continuous basis versus something that's more commonly done around 5-7 years, or exam committee decides that it's time for a new job analysis because the content has shifted drastically or significantly. So the other thing is, is it a dedicated function versus not? So CFA was very unique in this, where they had a dedicated staff to conduct these job analyses, and the consultant that worked along with them. So, and it was continuous. So a lot of groups are not doing that. They hire, typically hire a consultant to do that work, and it happens every so often. And then the scope, with their scope, it's a much larger. They're looking at a huge body of knowledge that's a lot of pages. And they just update it, and it grows every year and grows every year. So this leads to their body of knowledge versus something that's more competency-based framework, which is, asking SMEs to look at what people do and what they need to know to do it. And it's at a certain level of competency or expected competency, and that becomes the examination linked back to a bunch of references for the item writers at the end of the day. So certainly their practice analysis is very different from the more common practices across these 5 organizations. So I'm going to have Jen talk about curriculum and learning.
All right, thank you, Manny. So 3 points related to curriculum development and the learning experience. That's kind of the longhand version of curriculum and learning. One is the source and really who owns it. So what we found is that some groups own their own. They owned it and they developed it themselves. And then there were some other groups that either outsourced it or licensed it or left it completely to prep providers. So they didn't get into the prep game at all. So there was quite a bit of variability there. Second area was scope, and scope of the content we found almost always mapped back to the test blueprint or the JTA. So that was the underpinning, kind of the skeleton, if you will, upon which everything was built. And in terms of the third area, in terms of frequency of updates, by far and away, every 3 to 5 years was the most common response as far as how frequently the curriculum was updated in terms of a fairly sizable revision.
Okay, so we talk about exam development as well as exam administration. So when we talk about exam development, it's really looking at how you put together your examination items essentially. So looking at this, when they're looking at the recruitment of SMEs, they did use a combination of internal, external SMEs, and that was a common model to use, is to recruit a lot of external SMEs. And they did a lot of outsourcing in terms of a lot of the exam development functions, including, most of the activities of that, except the standard setting and the cut score decisions. And then what they had was they had a number of staff, and cost development would really vary a lot by the size, essentially, staff and the costs and things like that. And we're looking at the items or questions themselves. There was a lot of variability on how items are triggered into retirement, so what and how long they have it on and things like that. So there's a lot of variability in the industry around that. So moving on to exam administration, most of this, when we did this, it was it was not yet CBT, it was paper and pencil. So that's a big thing to look at. And another thing that happened was that there was the way they measured their metrics really varied, across different organizations in terms of secret shoppers, exam review boards, psychometric oversight committees, periodic reviews of a lot of different things like items and things like that, how they deal with customer complaints. So a lot of the things during the administration was how they measured it was across the board as well. One of the costs of administration, CFA, because they did paper-based testing, was very expensive to deliver, and they were one of the more expensive groups in terms of the cost of their administration. The seat time between all organizations was about 2 to 4 hours, and then when they received their score reports, many of the organizations were immediate, but up to 3 weeks was not uncommon for a lot of organizations. So we're going to get into takeaways now, and Chris, if you could share your takeaways. There was a lot that we did, and there was a lot to really digest, so a lot to even consider in terms of implementation.
Yeah, I think most organizations were remarkably similar in how they structure themselves and they conduct the key activities. There were some differences in how they evaluate themselves, but honestly, I regret I'm not going to be able to join you for the Q&A, and I really wish we could have all been together for an interactive discussion, because I think over the past few months, this analysis has been simmering in the back of my mind as we've gone through COVID And as we've all been dealing with all of those related adjustments. And so, as part of those current issues, as well as within the context of broader changes going on in education and in our industry, we find ourselves at CFA Institute needing to really reevaluate our strategy and operating model, and in order to emphasize speed and agility and flexibility in ways that just weren't as important to us before. So we find ourselves looking, taking this analysis, but also looking beyond it into places like the software industry to see what we can learn about applying agile principles to our development of content for both the curriculum and the exam, so we can scale up and down as we need, so we can explore more new markets more readily, so we can operate more cost effectively, and ultimately just so that we're able to deliver content onto the exam a lot more quickly. So we're exploring, agile development. We're deploying rapid item development around both curriculum and the exam. And interestingly, going back to my earlier comment about the remarkable similarity of how we're all structured, I imagine a lot of you are going through similar things. And so I really, sorry for the teaser, but I hope that at a future ATP we can all kind of discuss that, our takeaways and how we've adapted.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm really curious of what Jen's ahas were given all of Chris's.
Sure. One thing I'll point out, one of the ahas, I guess is a better way to describe it, is that something that we're really not measuring is the multiple avenues and ways that we respond to our customer requests, and whether, the time and whether or not those are effective. So we're not really measuring customer satisfaction and the importance of communication as much as we could be. And I think there's some opportunities there. The other part of customer satisfaction where there seems to be some opportunities for us as an industry to look at things differently, consider a different perspective, is that we typically focused in and measured the testing component only. So what was the customer's experience with the testing portion, registering all the way through the exam administration. But really, when you think about the candidate journey, it starts much earlier. It starts with, asking questions about the program. And then there's preparation involved, and questions about preparation, and then, and then it also goes all the way through recertification as well. So we don't really look at that full customer journey. I'll also add that I don't think we track it necessarily by individual either to see how that individual journey went all the way through. So there's some opportunities to look at, to broaden the journey and what we're measuring and when we're starting to measure. I think because we could be looking at it more holistically. As far as curriculum and test prep, this is an area of great interest to me because there wasn't really a lot of standard practice around who owns the curriculum and also the scope of the content. So it kind of begs some questions strategically that I think programs may want to stop to think in terms of whether or not, for those that do have prep or don't have prep and are considering it, in terms of how that's structured. And some of the strategic questions I thought would be particularly appropriate are things such as, what's the purpose of the prep content? Are you intending to teach the body of knowledge, or are you focusing it on exam prep only, sort of the crash course? One thing I'll point out is that I'm seeing a little bit more of adaptive learning systems now, where you have a body of content and then you carve personalized pathways through that body of knowledge by a lot of the assessments that you're giving individuals up front. And perhaps that's a nice, healthy hybrid solution that kind of can deliver both. Second question is, who owns the content? Do you want to own it yourself, or do you want others to build it? Is it a rev share, or are you really using your SMEs to then create your own content, and it's something that you own and can license out if you would like? How restrictive do you want your ecosystem to be? In the scenario I just gave, in terms of where you own it, you can license it out. You can have an authorized provider channel. You could be the sole provider. So it all depends on how you want to play in the space, but that's a very important consideration when on the business side, when you're considering preparation. Who owns the practice exam? And it doesn't really have to be as valid and reliable as the actual exam. So that's another question to consider. I think there are a lot of opportunities for greater alignment and coordination between prep and exam functions. I think many of us know there's like a wall between test and prep, but that wall seems to be dividing us organizationally as well, to the extent that there's absolutely no line of sight into what the prep function is doing. And so there's no communication. So I think, so it's very limited line of sight into just even how the curriculum is updated and how prep is developed, and certainly not a lot of alignment with what's going to be on the exam. So it seems that there are opportunities, even for those organizations that are accredited, there may be opportunities to at least organizationally collaborate more, to have a little bit more of an aligned product. I think it sounds like it's maybe taken a little bit too far, and I think it's to the detriment of the alignment between our educational materials as well as our exams. So might want to think about ways that there could be greater collaboration while still maintaining that healthy distance and not teaching to the test. So the final area of takeaways for me was really related to benchmarking. One thing I found is, although there's some spectacular similarities across all of us, I think there are also a lot of differences as well. And it kind of begged the question for me is, now that we sort of understand that there are these similarities and differences, I would love to know which is more effective, like which ways are most effective, and some kind of evaluation as to what a best practice is. So I think all of that is around just encouraging, for those of you that are sponsoring research, or for those of you, encouraging us as an industry to continue the inquiry, continue comparing notes, continue to measure and benchmark, and really have conversations related to what's working and what isn't, so that we can really benefit from learning. So I really appreciate and encourage future studies such as this as a benefit to the industry. One sort of MacGyver approach, or quick, not a MacGyver approach necessarily, but one quick tip that was given is, because there's such a lack of apples to apples comparative data out there, and there's a lack of data period to benchmark against, one really nice way to be able to do it that's really inexpensive is to use your testing vendor, your testing partner, to ask them really if they can provide you with some aggregated comparative data from their other programs, again aggregated, so that you can benchmark your programs against some of the data that they have in their systems. So they, for one particular interview, they had mentioned that they were able to pull data. Their testing partner pulled data for them, and they were able to do it at very little cost, if any cost at all. So that's a really cost-effective way to capture data that's already there. So those were really my takeaways, with some additional commentary. Back to you, Manny.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Chris and Jen. The thing that sticks out with me is strategic strategy and strategic alignment. So, and that's where the purpose fits in. What is the whole purpose of your examination? What are the outcomes you want to focus on? Do you want people who are really qualified? How qualified do you want them to be? Who are the people involved in terms of stakeholders, employers, candidates, the community, the better safety and the better good of the community, the level of criticality that might occur with your examination. If someone doesn't do something, does it mean that someone can actually die from it if they don't do it properly? So those are the things you want to think about when you're looking at this. And I think a lot of groups don't come back to that as often as they should. And in terms of the next sort of takeaway is complexity. So we found that I think a lot of these programs are unnecessarily complex. Why do you have all these different item types on there? Can you still get it? Can you still use one item type versus another item type to get to what you need to get to, which goes back to your purpose and aligning that strategy? Do we need to update the JTA every year? Why do you need this or that? So there's a lot of things, and reducing your items, the number of items on your exam and things like that. And the other thing that you want to look at is the qualifications of people on your team. Do you need to have more qualified people or more experienced people who are uncredentialing to help you with some of this, making some of these complexities more simple? If you have like a committee that's just a volunteer committee that you can get together, maybe pay them a little bit money, maybe they do it voluntarily, with a lot of really good credentialing experienced folks and some psychometricians and other testing professionals on that committee. Maybe they could really help you out, save money, save time, be more efficient and efficacious as well. So these are some things to think about, and I think that's an incredible takeaway, and it all comes back to the strategy and the purpose. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues for joining me on this session and how we evaluated programs across the industry, and we hope that it did give you some information that you could take back and use. We're very, very curious during the Q&A sessions what you thought about of areas that you can evaluate to maybe help the industry further to look into these things. And as Jen was saying, hopefully we could start benchmarking some of these things and have maybe ATP take that on, or another organization out there that could take that on. But for the Q&A session, we're curious, like in one word, how would you sum this up, or what's your takeaway? And then what are your own key takeaways from this? So with that, prepare your questions for the live Q&A session that ATP will be doing with us, and think about those questions. And we want to thank you for your time, and I hope you got something out of this, and I hope you have a great day. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.